Okay, here we go. We're going to be talking about how gendered expectations of participants or students kind of limit our abilities to bring our full selves to the table, whether we are the participants or whether we're staff or faculty in whatever capacities we work in. So that's a little bit about what we're going to be getting at today. In a moment, Perry is going to be giving you a quick overview of the presentation and also just saying hi for the first time.
Hi, everybody. I'm Perry. Thanks for being here. Meg and I are really excited about today. And we wanted to start with a little bit about who we are, because we think that's really important for today's topic, that you understand where we're coming from, our identities, our perspective, and our ability to speak to and from some of these issues. So we also really want to put it out there that we're incredibly open to answering questions and talking about our own personal experiences as members of the community that we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to talk about why we care about this, and really why we hope that you will care about this, and what this can kind of offer you as a practitioner, as an educator, how it can hopefully help enhance what you currently do by just helping you be more inclusive. So we're going to go over a list of things of what you need to know, some of our best, or as Meg likes to call them, better practices for what we currently do in the field, what we've observed, and some research that we have observed and studied and written about ourselves. Meg?
Yeah. And then we're going to kind of, after that overview, we're going to talk about the things that we think you need to know. So we're going to go over some terminology, and then kind of talk about conceptually, like, what is this idea of gender, hopefully demystify or possibly just complicate your understanding of gender, and answer some questions that people often have when talking about new terms or new phrases that are coming into use. And then we're going to talk about how, so going back to those better practices, what are the ways that you can take that either new knowledge or expanded knowledge that we share in the concepts and terminologies, how can you implement that into the workspaces and environments that you're in? And then after that, we're going to allow for some time for question and answer. And hopefully at that point, we can get more specific into the questions and maybe what brought you all to joining us today, and what you're all hoping to do with this information after the webinar.
All right, so I am Perry Cohen. I am the founder and director and an instructor with the Venture Out Project, which is an organization that leads backpacking and paddling and camping trips for the LGBTQ community. And I founded this about 1.5 years ago because I'm trans myself, and I identify as queer as well. And I had grown up doing Outward Bound and being an outdoor ed and loving it, but always feeling a little bit unsure of when I was about to go into a wilderness setting of if I was going to be recognized and feel emotionally and physically safe, because there's little nuances of being in the wilderness, for example, going to the bathroom in tent groups, that can be kind of hard for a trans or queer or non-binary person. And I'll go into those terms in a little while, so if you don't know them, we'll get there, I promise. And it's been really amazing what has come out of this project. We've had a lot of people find us, I mean, as far as Canada, I'm based in Massachusetts, down in Atlanta, because there's been a real need for this in our community. And what people have said is it's wonderful to go outside, and we love doing the traditional orientation trips at school and Outward Bound and Knowles and that kind of stuff. But we do always kind of feel a little bit nervous. And so it's been really nice to find a group where we can just kind of be ourselves and not worry about all these things that we might have to explain up front. So along with leading those trips, we do education. And I'm really excited to partner with Meg on this. I kind of heard about her for a while and was excited to finally get to work with her. And as Dan said, I've been a member of AEE. I've presented at the regional conferences. I also work with High Five up in Vermont doing this stuff. So I'm really excited to be here. And again, I know, not to beat a dead horse, but I think one of the barriers that people find to talking about trans and gender nonconforming issues is they're so afraid to ask the wrong question that they don't ask one. So please know we're here to know that you're coming from a good place. And if you ask it in the wrong way, we might gently correct you on how to ask it better, but we appreciate that you're engaging in this topic. So we hope you will. Hey.
All right, cool. Thanks, Perry. So I'm Meg. I am a creator of resources and basically a full-time professional social justice kid. So right now I run two different online organizations that or help run two online organizations that hope to put resources into the community so that people can help foster these social justice dialogues and know how to kind of create activities and engage others around social justice issues. So the first is the Safe Zone Project, which focuses on helping people start conversations around gender and sexuality. And the second is the Social Justice Toolbox, which aims to be a little bit more broad and focuses on social justice activities at large and helping people enter the conversation around diversity and social justice issues. When I'm not working on those online projects, my favorite thing to do is to do small group in-person workshops. And I might refer to this as a workshop a lot because I'm so used to doing workshops, and being a facilitator is really my favorite place to be. I got involved with the AAE community about 5 years ago when I was an undergrad at Hamilton College in upstate New York, when I led pre-orientation wilderness trips. And I presented at the Northeast Regional a bunch, and then at the International probably 3 or 4 times now. And while I'm not doing a lot of experiential ed these days, I still feel a huge kinship and camaraderie with the AE community. And so I love doing social justice in this space and bringing it to folks such as yourselves. My other area of interest is in higher ed. And when we saw a lot of people sign up today, it seemed like we had a pretty split group of people in higher ed settings as well as in adventure and outdoor environments. So I welcome all of you to this conversation. I also wanted to say that I identify as somebody who is gender nonconforming, which again, we'll kind of cover that in the terminology section, but basically I don't look like you'd expect most women to look. I identify as gender nonconforming, as gay, lesbian, or queer, depending on the day, and I'm happy to speak from any of those identities. So yeah, now that we've kind of gone over who we are, let's talk about what we're here to learn today. So basically, people are identifying openly as trans, as gender nonconforming in increasing numbers, and we're finding that a lot of people are having participants or students openly identify with gender identities and in ways that they haven't encountered before, and so they don't know how to support these people, ensure that their policies and practices are inclusive, and even past inclusive, that they're affirming and celebrating these different identities that are coming to the forefront. And so that's why we are talking about this topic now. We both have been personally passionate about it for a long time, but we're finding that there's kind of a nice overlap now between like seeing the need and then people feeling the want to also like meet that need, and to be able to go into it with more experience and more confidence on how to serve these populations. And we also want to say that it's not just about people who identify as gender nonconforming or people who identify as trans. We believe that this conversation expands everybody's abilities to bring themselves to the forefront and to bring their whole selves without having to worry about gendered expectations. So Perry is now going to talk a little bit more about this research and evidence that we found around these issues.
Yeah, so as Meg said, this topic is starting to come to the fore, but it's still really new. I think, we can all recognize that Caitlyn Jenner, for good or bad, has done a lot to publicize kind of trans justice issues. And because it's so new, there's actually very little research anywhere, but particularly in the outdoor ed and adventure ed field. So the bulk of research is coming from psychology, body studies, cultural studies, and stuff like that. But there was recently a really well done study by Meyer and Borey that I just love this quote that came out of it, that wilderness can be more than just fun and adventure in the woods, but also a refuge from normative gender, which reminds us that in the wilderness there is a model of emancipation and freedom. And I think that speaks to, regardless of gender, that speaks to why so many of us love the wilderness anyways. It's kind of a a way out, a refuge, a space where we can connect with ourselves, with others, with nature. And what this study and then the subsequent study kind of supported is that when people feel affirmed, so when they feel seen as their gender identity that they're telling you that they are, when they feel seen and valued as an LGBT person, they actually get a lot out of these experiences. However, on the contrary to that, this second study, well, two studies actually found that when people do not feel supported and able to be safely open about their identities, trans, gender nonconforming, all LGBT folks actually was what this study included, feel that they devote about 50% of their mental energy to staying closeted, staying safe, worrying about pronoun use, worrying about when they talk about their partner, if they're saying she or he, if they're going to be outed. So what that does is minimize significantly the amount that they can actually get out of the wilderness experience. And this was true for participants, students, and staff alike. One of these studies was actually done with primarily lesbian staff from an outward bound organization, field school. And they said that they spent so much time worrying that they felt like they couldn't be great leaders and instructors to their students because they were so worried about being outed and losing their jobs, losing their health insurance. So I share this because I think it's really important to recognize what being closeted might take away from somebody and how it can impact a program, and how when you're not necessarily part of that marginalized population, you might not even realize that it's a big deal to be a lesbian in the woods, where in 2015 it should be no problem. Everybody should feel included. But, until recently, people felt like they could be fired. And some still do. And so that's a very real issue. So the research supports that the wilderness is good for all of us. It's particularly good for gender nonconforming folks because it takes them out of kind of cultural norms and settings where they feel microaggressions constantly, puts them in a safer space. But it only does that when they feel like their instructors and the organizations that they're working with are affirming them and creating a safe space for them to identify as they choose to identify. So now Meg is going to go into a little bit more about personally why we think this is important.
Yeah, so that was an awesome review of the research, and somebody just made a comment that the research is really important, and we appreciate that. Wanted to also say that if you have a comment, we would love you to throw that into the chat feature. And if you have a question, if we could keep the questions to the Q&A, that would be awesome. If that's confusing on y'all's end, don't worry. We want the feedback and the interaction more than you worrying about which place it should go in. But I just wanted to name, if you do have like comments or thoughts throughout, feel free to put them in that chat feature, and questions, please bring them into that Q&A. So in addition to the research, why do we personally think this is so important? Beyond our own personal identities, we believe that all of us are involved in the AE community, and we're in whatever field we're in to help people bring their full selves and help them connect to their full potential. And we believe that learning and unlearning around gender norms is necessary to accomplish this goal. So I think what's so powerful about what Perry was saying about the wilderness is this idea of like helping us reconnect to ourselves and who we are. And I think that what's so cool is also social justice can do that as well. So learning about social justice can really help us reconnect to who we are and understand kind of our truest or best selves. So I think they have really similar goals, and what's wonderful is when they can meet like we're making them today. So for me, bringing social justice and the AE community into the same space is something that I'm really passionate about. And so I'm really personally invested in getting people to kind of go through this process of learning about gender so they can see how it comes into their everyday lives as well as their workspaces, and help us when we take kind of gender off of the center, what other things can start to come to the forefront for those experiences and for people. And I just wanted to name that that Dan let us know you all only have the access to Q&A, which is great, which means feel free to just throw all that you want to interact in that question and answer portion. So yeah, we appreciate people chiming in that way. Now Perry's going to talk a little bit about about his perspective.
Yeah, sorry about that. Trying to find my unmute button. Um, so much like Meg, this is kind of a coming together of my worlds, of a social justice lens that I approach everything with, as well as my love for the outdoors. And so personally, being a member of this community, it was really important to me to realize that I actually had something to offer the community, both of queer people, but also of experiential and outdoor education people. So I was an academic for a good portion of my life and thought that's where I was going to head with my career. And then I started becoming a practitioner, and I found that I felt like I made so much more of an impact because I could connect my personal stories, my personal experiences with the research and with folks who identified like me. And so my hope for today is that by sharing my story and my experiences, and Meg's story and her experiences, you can take away one or two nuggets that help you kind of understand why this is so important, like Meg said, not just for gender nonconforming and trans folks, but for everybody to recognize that we don't always like to be categorized by somebody else or put into identity boxes, whatever it is, whether it's about gender or race or marital status or age or anything like that. But the power of self-determination and agency is really amazing. And the more we can enable our participants and our students and our staff to do that, the more we're all going to get out of these experiences. So that's really my hope for today, and why I'm invested in this personally, is that you can take away a couple nuggets, a couple better practices, and turn them into your own and incorporate them into the ways that you work, and just try to recognize and acknowledge one other form of identity that some folks may come to you with.
Awesome. So we would love to pause here and to get a little bit of feedback from folks, because you all, as far as I know, haven't been required to come today. You signed up of your own free will, which is epic. And we would love to know, like, what is it that brought you to wanting to be involved in this? Why are you already personally invested enough to, to come and join our webinar today? So if you want to use that Q&A feature, if you'd be up for that, we would love to know, why do you feel like this topic is important? And why are you personally invested in learning more, or professionally invested in learning more? You can, if you wouldn't mind submitting that into, I think it'll probably pose it as a question, but I know it's our question to you. But we would just love to know, like, what brought people to the webinar, and why are you all personally invested in this work? So if people have ideas, that would be great, and we would love to see them in that Q&A. And if you wanted to speak to one of those ideas, or one of those reasons for you, if you wanted to hit that raise your hand feature, Dan can promote you, and we can have you share with the group your thoughts. We would just love to see some thoughts on that, if people would be willing to share. And we're going to read out some of them so that people, so that folks can kind of hear why other people are interested in being in this space. So far we have folks sharing that they're just trying to understand what they don't know so far. So a little bit of like, you don't know, but you're not sure what that is. Someone else is part of starting a 30-day inpatient substance abuse treatment track for the LGBT community, which is awesome. If folks don't know, the LGBTQ community has higher rates of substance abuse. So it sounds that's kind of meeting a need that unfortunately our community is in more need for. So that's awesome. And someone else shared that they are a graduate student, and social justice is a huge part of their program, which is great. So kind of hitting it from all angles. Perry, do you want to read out a couple of these?
Yeah, sure. They're a few people are talking about how they're interested in bringing this back to their colleges and universities. Sounds like one person said they're in a community where nearly 70% of their student and staff identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So I think it's interesting to see how as more people feel more able to identify with more kind of dimensions along the spectrum, the percentages are increasing for sure. Yeah, more people have students who are LGBTQ. And a couple people are talking about how they're interested in learning how to move beyond the gender binary of traditional male and female only, but be more expansive, fluid, and inclusive. And definitely some folks, I think, in a living situation, whether it's on campus in dorms or in tents or whatever, did by male and female, how can we do it now? How do we see who may have questions about trans folks?
Great. Yeah. So we have a real diversity of why folks are here, but it seems like in some ways these issues are touching personally different aspects of everybody's lives. And it seems like a lot of folks are coming into more contact with folks who do identify as gender nonconforming or trans, and really wanting to know how best to support them before support and affirm them. And so coming to get some more information, that's the big theme that I see, is a lot of people are working more directly with these folks or these issues, and wanting to become more supportive and more educated in the idea. So that's awesome.
Great. Thanks for sharing, everybody. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to move into talking a little bit more about terminology and getting into that, like, what do you need to know in order to create these inclusive environments? And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with that word, with inclusive environments, because we often hear that language. So an inclusive environment for us is one where all parties involved feel safe, welcome, and affirmed. This may mean taking specific action to let individuals within a marginalized community know that they're welcome. So that second part of the definition for me is really important, because it's not something that you can just assume about an environment. That when I walk into a space, there's certain things that I'm weary about, both because of I'm being queer and being gender nonconforming. There may be some things that I'm like, is this a space that's okay for me? And an inclusive environment lets me know that it's okay for me. So that may mean like having going through a staff training and being able to show via some kind of sticker or insignia that, like, oh, we care about these things here, so we went to a specific training for it. Or it may be that I know because your intake form has a line for gender rather than it says gender and then it has male and female, which sometimes makes me feel like, oh, that's pretty limited for having an understanding of gender that's more expansive than that. So there's a lot of different ways that we set up inclusive environments, but basically one where people feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be here. They inspire this sense of belonging. And the idea that an inclusive environment isn't just one where you can be like a tolerant environment, but one that is actually like welcoming and affirming, which means like, hey, we want you here. You're part of who we're purposefully trying to attract or create a space for. And so it's important to know that sometimes that means taking specific action, because certain folks within marginalized communities don't know that something is for them without that specific action being taken. So
yeah. Great. So Meg just used the word affirmed, which is really important, and is distinct from just inclusion and definitely different from being tolerated. So I think this quote is really helpful too. Being queer is about recognizing the ways one represents otherness, the unexplored or the disallowed, then despite prejudice and injustice, insisting again and again that one belongs and one is gifted, not in spite of these queer differences, but because of them. So to me, that part in italics is what really distinguishes being affirmed versus being tolerated. If I'm tolerated, I feel like I'm allowed in a space and people are kind of looking at me funny and they know I'm there, but they're tolerating me because they know either the law requires them to, or they're educated enough to know that it's not okay to discriminate against me. But I still don't feel welcome. I'm still going to feel very probably anxious and super aware of my surroundings and not be taking in what they want me to be taking in, but be taking in microaggressions and kind of constantly assessing my safety. Versus if I feel affirmed and welcomed, and in fact celebrated for my diversity, and not just me, but anybody, but for our differences, that's a very different feeling. So to Meg's point, recognizing it on intake forms, just one of the things actually we meant to do, and I'm still learning this webinar, so I was a little nervous, forgot to do, but asking people their pronouns, and not just the queer or the obviously, gender nonconforming people, but everybody's pronouns. So when somebody says, hey, nice to meet you, what are your pronouns? I immediately feel, wow, that's awesome. And they've said their pronouns as well. So it's little, very small things like that can make somebody feel affirmed, or very clearly saying on their intake form a preferred name, or clearly not segregating things by gender or by race, or kind of categories that invite discrimination. So that's what we talk about with affirmation versus tolerance, which used to be seen as a really good thing, and is better than overt discrimination, but is kind of de facto discrimination. So next we're going to talk about marginalized and privilege. Meg.
Yeah, so we've used that term maybe a couple times already, is this idea of being marginalized. So a brief definition would be: a group or an individual is marginalized when their needs, interests, or values are treated as peripheral. So when we say like, oh, well, that's a special case, or that's a special need, then that's when a community is seen as marginalized. So they have less access to power, less access of being seen as normal, and it's also in juxtaposition to the privileged group. And you can experience marginality or being marginalized both on like a systemic level, on an institutional level, and also on an individual level. So you might experience being marginalized in a one-on-one moment, but it's also something that happens kind of across the board at a group level, which means that a whole chunk of population is experiencing a particular type of bias. And the reason that we wanted to talk about this is because we often hear this term marginalized, but we don't necessarily break it down to see what that means. And something that we wanted to throw out to you was kind of like, was a question around, how do we know an identity is marginalized? So some of the marginalized identities that we're going to be talking about today are folks who are gender nonconforming, folks who are trans, but there's folks who identify with queer sexualities. So that could be gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual. So we know that these identities are marginalized, but what does it mean to be marginalized, and what are experiences that people have when they are marginalized? That would be a question I would love to hear some folks chime in on. Is like, if I said, well, gay people are marginalized or trans people are marginalized, and somebody said like, well, how do you know that? How would you all respond to that? What would you say? How do you know that an identity is marginalized? So if anybody has any thoughts, we would love you to drop that into the Q&A, just in response to, how do you know an identity is marginalized? Any specific examples would be great. And if we get some thoughts on that, we will share them out with you.
Okay, maybe while we're waiting for those, we'll go on to talk about privilege a little bit.
Yeah, that's great.
I feel like privilege is a word that, again, gets thrown around a lot, and is kind of the hot button these days. We talk about white privilege, we talk about hetero privilege, all kinds of privilege. And so what privilege is the state of having abilities, access, or rights that another group does not experience. And the tough thing about privilege is that it's so normalized that it becomes invisible. So the classic example of having privilege is, when I open up a box of Band-Aids, I see a Band-Aid that matches my skin color, and I don't even think about it because it just seems normal. When a person of color opens up a Band-Aid box, it doesn't match their skin. So it's immediately something of thinking, oh, I'm not normal. Johnson & Johnson, when they created their Band-Aids, didn't make them for me. And if I want Band-Aids that match my skin, I've got to go to a special store or, order them or whatever it is. So that's the danger in it, is that we don't recognize it because it's so invisible to us, because the world is created around those forms of privilege. And that's what makes it so dangerous, is that I may deny it, which in turn hurts more people because I don't even see it. And so I think this is an issue often in outdoor ed because of the populations that we're often working with. And another, I suppose, interesting thing about privilege is that there's a thing called intersectionality. So I have all these different forms of identity. So I have white privilege. I have the privilege of being very educated. I have a certain degree of economic privilege. So even though I may be a marginalized person as a trans and a queer person, people don't necessarily know that when they look at me. And there's always this strange power dynamic at play. And so we're in a bit of this double bind, working with these populations in outdoor ed, is that we want to acknowledge our privilege, recognize that it gives us certain advantages, and not use it as a power play over folks that don't have those privileges. And at the same time, identify that within the populations we're working with. So helping them to recognize that there are different power dynamics and different privileges within the group you're working with.
Yeah, and something I really wanted to, I want to highlight why we put both of these words on the same slide is often we'll talk about the discrimination side, but we won't talk about the privilege side. So whenever you have an experience of discrimination, like, hey, flesh tone Band-Aids only are, flesh tone to certain populations. We'll talk about that as an experience of marginalization or an experience of discrimination, but we don't necessarily always talk about the flip side of privilege because of that invisible component that Perry was speaking to. So we just wanted to highlight that anytime there is marginality, that means we're also privileging another group. So often when we talk about, well, we're making accommodations for this one group, we're already making a choice to be specifically kind of exclusive to somebody else when we're marginalizing a particular group or a particular individual. So just wanted to talk about whenever somebody's down, that means somebody else is up.
Yeah, so just to give a specific example within the trans and the queer community, pronouns would be a great example of privilege. So a cisgender person, which is somebody whose gender identity aligns with their assigned sex at birth, wouldn't feel the need to explain their pronouns because they might look the way you'd expect a man to look and then use he pronouns and feel comfortable with that. Whereas somebody who is trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, you might pause and wonder what their pronouns are. And so a way of kind of disavowing that privilege is to say, we're going to ask everybody their pronouns versus just the people who look like we need to ask them their pronouns. So that might be an example of ways in which you can kind of destabilize some of that privilege that often exists.
Awesome.
So we had a couple of questions pop up here, talking about examples of marginalization and privilege. So one example that somebody gave about marginalization was a same-sex couple walking down the street holding hands may enter a space where they don't feel like they can present their partner. They may have to think twice about that. They may not feel safe. They may question, whereas a straight couple holding hands is no big deal wherever they are in whatever country they're in.
Another example someone mentioned was the idea that anytime you have to describe a population by a specific term, so like female leaders would be an example of, we have to put the word female before, because if we don't, we're just going to assume either we're going to assume everybody's male, or that's kind of our default image. So in my mind, when we say, like, if you have a default image of what either like a student or a population or a participant, looks like, that's likely going to be shaped by this understanding of like what's normal, or who shows up in those spaces most often. And often we build environments or practices around kind of like that typical person. And that typical person, we often don't break down to see like, well, who is that typical person? What privileges do they come with identities, and what are their needs? And that leaves us blind to a lot of the things that we may be missing unintentionally, but can create a real difference of who feels comfortable, who feels welcome. A lot of the examples that people gave were around safety, this idea that you have to like question whether you're going to be safe or welcomed in an environment, which goes back to that, like why it's so important to be purposefully inclusive and to take steps towards that, towards kind of communicating a purposeful space of affirmation, because it's not something that everybody else can assume. Okay, so feel free to continue to ask questions and or kind of chime into those answers. And like we said, please feel free to drop questions in there that we'll try to get to throughout, but also we'll leave time at the end for some Q&A. So we wanted to go over some of these terms that we often hear and that we often we've already used today. So this term queer is a bit of an umbrella term, which is why it's represented by this umbrella in the graphic, which means there's a bunch of terms that sit underneath it and can kind of be housed and thought of as incorporated. So if you hear somebody say like the queer community, they may be referring to the LGBT community. They may be referring to any one of these specific identities underneath. It can be used both as a term to identify sexualities, so who you're attracted to, who you form relationships with, as well as genders, so the ways that you identify yourself, and the way that you want other people to identify you. So just wanted to also break out that we often say LGBTQ without busting out the difference between some of those are sexuality terms and some of those are gender terms. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, those are all sexualities. Those are referring to the people that you're attracted to or the attractionality that you experience. Whereas trans or transgender, that's talking about your gender. So how you identify your gender and how you want other people to identify you. So it's important to know that if we're saying like, oh, we're LGBTQ inclusive, that you're also talking about like gender and sexuality. You're not just talking about like gay issues or queer issues. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that those two things are distinctly different, but often grouped into the same community. And so it's important to be able to hold those kind of different aspects of the larger queer community. So the next thing we want to talk about is something that we've touched on a little bit, but what is this often confusing and sometimes conflated understanding of gender and sex?
Yeah, so similar to sexuality and gender is this is like Meg said, these often get conflated. So we've got biological sex on the right hand, and that's typically your physical body, right? So your hormones, your chromosomes, your genitalia. Whereas when we talk about gender, it's kind of social expectations that are connected to the physical body. So because of social norms and kind of the way we were raised and what happens around us, we expect that male-bodied people grow up to be men and identify as such. But gender is really self-determined, right? So as a trans person, I was assigned female at birth, and I say assigned because the doctor put that on me. That was my sex. They looked at the baby that came out and said, "Oh, you have a girl. Happy, happy." And then more and more I said, that doesn't really fit. So my gender identity became very different from my biological sex. But important to note is that I think there's been kind of a rash of media around people coming out lately. And there have been more people coming out. And a large part of that is because gender, because we self-determine that, it's based on what we see. And I'm 39. When I was growing up, I didn't see trans people. I saw men and I saw women, and my parents saw men and women. And so I felt like I had two choices. Now people see a whole broad spectrum and fluidity of gender. And so that's a large part of why we're seeing more people identify somewhere along the continuum or as something beyond the binary, not because there are more people who are born that way, but because it's more accessible to folks. So, but the key here is that sex is biological and gender is social.
Awesome. So to expand that a little more, there's this graphic that I find particularly useful to kind of break out all of these different aspects of our identity into distinct components. So Perry just reviewed gender identity, which is represented by the brain because it's self-determined and it's in your head. You get to set your gender identity. And biological sex, which is largely still attached to physicalities and biology. Not that you can't change or shift either of those things, but that's how society still kind of operates and understands those two terms. Attraction we talked about before, and we're not going to focus this webinar on attraction, so we're not going to go into it too in depth. But something that you should know is for that attraction is talking about both who you're sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to, because some people experience large or small amounts of either of those things. And that's important when you're talking about being inclusive, especially of asexual people, is that sexuality isn't just all about sexual attraction. It can also be about the warm and fuzzies of the romantic attraction. And then gender expression is the term that we kind of haven't gone into. So I just wanted to review that. So gender expression is about the way that you perform out or express your gender to other people. And this is where gender nonconformity comes in. So I identify as a cisgender woman, which means like I was assigned female at birth. And I also identify as a woman, which is how we expect female-bodied people to identify. But I also look like this. And people often, especially in the winter, mistake me for a 14-year-old boy, which is really fascinating. And completely okay, because I understand that like most women don't look like me. And that's because my gender expression is very masculine. Me and Perry could probably like share a wardrobe, which is great, but it's just not expected, right? So my gender expression is very masculine. My gender identity is woman, and my biological sex is female. And we often expect all of those things to align in a particular fashion. We say like, oh, okay, somebody's a woman, and we have a particular image of that person. And a particular expectation of about how they're going to look and how they're going to express their gender, what things they're going to like, what colors, how heavy a pack they can carry, all of those things. And we'll get into some of that in a moment. But I just wanted to put this graphic up to show you that it is really important to hold all of these components separately, because we often use one to inform the other. And that can lead to a lot of assumptions that are really problematic and can get us in a lot of trouble and lead us to misgendering or using different pronouns or people calling me young man when that's just not how I identify. So hopefully this clarifies a little bit these different terms. And if you have a question about, well, which is the one we should be asking about, or what's the appropriate term to use in this moment, please throw that in the Q&A window, and we can jump back to that in the future.
I think one other point to make is that none of these are fixed. So on any given day, my gender expression could be more masculine or more feminine. I could be sexually attracted or romantically attracted to different people on different days. And so to recognize the fluidity in all of these, and as Meg's saying, none of them are dependent on each other. And sometimes there's connections, but there's no like predetermined necessary connections that always have to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that term fluid that we often are using is about people who experience kind of like if they were to plot themselves, that would change over time. Whereas some of us, like I have I have a pretty set gender expression, even though it's quite non-normative. Like I wouldn't say that I identify as gender fluid because it doesn't change that much. But it's something that is a possibility, and it's also why it's so important to do those kind of introductions and getting to know people over and over again, is because people can change over time. The pronouns that felt good last week may not feel good this week, and so that's going back to those better practices. Why those types of things is good to check in with people, because for some people it does change.
So to get into some definitions, and I just want to give a disclaimer that this is in no way inclusive. We're just going to hit on some popular terms, but I hope no one feels like we're excluding them or their identity or a particular term that's really important, because we are. certainly, but we can't list them all. So a lot of people are confused by what's this trans with an asterisk thing. And that's like, if you go in and do a search in the library and you do anything with an asterisk, it includes everything after that. So this is really used as an umbrella term to include as many ways of being trans as you can think of. So transgender, transsexual, transvestite, all those things are included in the body of trans with an asterisk, as are genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, gender nonconforming. And I think a really important thing to note about this too is that this is about identity. This has nothing to do with body. So someone can identify as trans and not have undergone any surgeries, not be on hormones or any of those things. So this is self-determined, more identity piece than a physical piece. So I hope that makes sense to people. So transgender, that's the trans kind of umbrella term. Transgender is people whose, for lack of a better term, whose gender identity doesn't match with the gender they were assigned at birth. So I identify as trans and transgender. Transsexual is someone who's transitioned from one gender to another. I also technically I'm transsexual, but I hate that term, so I would never say I identify as that. It feels kind of clinical and just not for me. Genderqueer, I think Meg has spoken to that a little bit, is more on the non-binary kind of queering or challenging traditional gender norms. Gender fluid would be folks who are more fluid, kind of move back and forth. Non-binary, again, just as I don't believe in this male, female, binary system. I'm not sure where I fall in the spectrum. I just know I'm not on either of those poles. Similarly, gender nonconforming is, again, I don't conform to traditional gender norms, whether that's in gender identity, gender presentation, is kind of, it can be amongst all of those parts. So I think the big thing to take away from here is it's okay to ask folks, what does that mean? I love it when people ask me what queer means or what trans means. It's a fun opportunity for me to get to talk about it, talk about my identity, and talk about what it means to me and how it's really, these are all evolving terms. And I think that and queer are exciting. They can all be used as verbs as well as nouns. And then I think the last piece, we use this a little bit, is cisgender. And that is when people's assigned sex at birth aligns with their gender identity. So the majority of folks identify as cisgender human beings. And that's, you'll often hear it referred to as cis. So trans and cis are kind of two very common terms that you will hear. And it's okay to ask if you're not sure.
Yeah, something I wanted to add to what Perry was saying was, when Perry was talking, you said, that term just isn't for me. Like, even if definition wise it may suit, it's not something that I identify with. That's something to know about all of these terms, that you might run into somebody and be like, oh, you must be gender fluid. And they're like, no, I'm agender. Or like, no, I'm just trans. And you'd be like, oh no, but like the definition I learned like definitely applies to you, right? Everybody can use the terms that they feel most comfortable with. Self-determination and self-definition is something that you just have a choice whether to like affirm or deny, but you can't actually change somebody's understanding of themselves. And so just wanted to clarify that, like, we want to give you a definition for these terms and to give you a starting place for them. But if you're right 51% of the time, or if you have like a better definition or starting place for these, that's what we want you to take away from it, rather than the idea that like, okay, now I can put people into the appropriate boxes that they're supposed to go into. Especially youth are like evolving and changing these terms to best suit them. And some of these terms may not even be used by certain folks anymore because they find them either too broad, too expansive, or just not, that they don't fit. So just know that this is a starting place, but as Perry said, if you need to know, okay, well, what does that mean for you? How can I best what do I need to know about that identity in order to best support you? Those are totally appropriate questions. Not everybody is an educator like me and Perry, which means sometimes, particularly if you're in like a social setting, people may not want to explain what it means to them. But asking questions is completely appropriate, and knowing, just wanted to reiterate that this is going to mean something different for everybody that you meet. And that the majority of these terms, like Perry said, you can use them as verbs, but they're also adjectives. So you wouldn't want to say like a transgender. You'd want to use it as an which would be using it as a noun. You would want to say it like a transgender person, or a trans man, or a trans woman. So when in doubt, adjectives are always safer than nouns, because they modify the person rather than making them into the definition that you're talking about. Okay, so what does this all mean? We've gone through a bunch of information today. We've talked a little bit about why we're talking about it. And basically, the most distilled idea is that we live in a society that makes a lot of assumptions on gender. So men are assumed, expected and rewarded to be stronger, independent, logical, have particular types of bodies and genitalia, and all of these assumptions show up in little ways that we do our work. So assumptions get us into trouble sometimes. And we're going to try to talk a little bit about what are those best practices we can, or better practices that we can get into to try to get out of our own way and out of our own assumptions. And we see that some of you have to take off because it's 3 o'clock, and that's completely okay. We really appreciate you being here. We will send everybody who's signed up a copy of the presentation. So if you don't reach the end, don't worry, we'll have it coming towards you. And we probably have about 15 more minutes before we get to the Q&A, just to give everybody else a bit of a timeline. And we'll probably wrap up the whole thing around 3:30. But if you do need to leave, feel free to do that, and we'll send the information your way. Excuse me.
Yeah. So some of these assumptions are perpetuate something called microaggressions, which is when we don't intend to offend somebody or marginalize somebody, but we do through things that we say that, again, we don't even realize kind of what we're doing because it's become a norm. So sometimes when we say, we'll ask men to carry heavier packs, or we'll say, hey, I need 3 strong guys to come lift this table or whatever. We're making assumptions about that tie strength to gender that aren't necessarily true. And things like when we teach about how to use the bathroom in the woods, we will often segregate and say, okay, boys go over here and girls go over there. And there's a handful of folks who are like, well, I don't know where I should go. So again, making these assumptions based on presentation about how somebody goes to the bathroom is not always right. And then, of course, the classic is when we call it, we're trying to avoid the funny business, I think is the technical term. We divide people into tent groups by boys and girls. And let me tell you, all those little gay kids are pretty pumped when we do that. So I think, again, just rethinking these assumptions and these norms and thinking, are there other ways that we can talk about the bathroom? Are there other ways we can divide packs and tent groups? And we will talk about that as we get into the better practices. But the point here is to just think of what are these assumptions that we're making based on bodily and physical presentation that are not necessarily connected to somebody's identity or actual physical characteristics and traits.
Okay, so we've referenced a couple of these things already, these policies and practices, and this is kind of not a completely inclusive list, but an expansive list of different things to think about, and maybe to evaluate with your supervisor, or if you are the supervisor, with your staff, about like, how are we doing these things and how could we do them better? So Perry's going to get into a little bit of how his organization works through some of these issues and what we think are some better practices around them. And something that we kind of wanted to highlight overall is that in any of these moments, if you're doing something that makes, if you're not taking into consideration that there are different ways that people may identify, someone may experience that as a microaggression. So, or just as a less welcoming or less affirming environment. So anytime that I go into an environment and they have all gender bathrooms, or some people call them gender neutral bathrooms, I'm pumped. And I don't identify as as trans. I have no problem with identifying as a woman. I just don't really care about my gender when I go to the bathroom. And I don't like people kind of trying to figure out, like, are you a dude? Are you not? And so I just want to pee. And so anytime I see all gender bathrooms, I feel more affirmed. I feel more welcomed. And so if I don't see them, it doesn't necessarily, for me, that's not necessarily a huge concern, but it may be for somebody else. And so, I get bummed if I don't have that option, and really excited if I do. And so, but for some people, that experience may be much more dramatic, and they just may not feel at all comfortable if there isn't that opportunity, and may experience it as a microaggression if they feel like they have to choose or they have to defend their choice of what bathroom to use or how to use the bathroom. So that's just an example, and something to think about is that these aren't just about, it's not just about creating welcoming and affirming environments. There's also the flip side to that, which is someone may experience it as a microaggression, which is like a small aggression, or experience of discrimination if that option isn't presented.
Yeah. So specifically how we get at making folks feel affirmed and included is, all over our website, we're obviously a queer-owned and operated organization, but we are very explicit in who we are and what we do, and I try to be more out and more open than I am in my normal daily life with our folks, so that they know that it's okay to be queer, it's okay to be out, it's also okay not to be, it's also okay to be straight. But we affirm kind of and celebrate difference and diversity with people. And we do that, first of all, by our staff being very open about who we are and our purpose for being in existence. But even from the very beginning, when somebody first applies, we will, on our intake form, we will ask for their preferred name. And just putting preferred lets somebody know that I'm not asking for their legal name. And the distinction in that is often people are called something different than their legal name. And so you may have been born Samuel, but you like to go by Samantha. And right away, for a trans person who sees a name format, they're all of a sudden thinking, do I have to put my legal name and that's going to out me, and am I going to feel safe? And I would say probably 50% of people don't even go beyond that. So they won't even apply to your program because all of a sudden they feel like they're going to see that my legal name doesn't match my preferred name, and I don't want to deal with that, so I'm just going to skip that. So that's a huge thing to do. So there are times when we need a legal name, right, for health forms, med forms, things like that, waivers. So I always put on their legal name, and then I'll put an asterisk, and down below I'll put a footnote that says, this is for legal purposes only. We will not disclose this name. We will call you by your preferred name, and we won't share this with anybody. So that kind of puts people at ease. And we also recognize, hey, there are legal reasons why I'll have to give you my name. But when you're upfront about saying, I know this could be a problem, that immediately lets people know, oh, they get this. They get what might be an issue for me. And then once people get on our courses and they start, the very first thing we do is introductions, and we do pronouns. And like I said, we do pronouns for everybody. And I'll show you a little graphic in a minute that's kind of a funny way to talk about how to do and don't do pronouns. But kind of like Meg was talking a little bit about this, and I don't like this word, but what we're trying to do is normalize asking for pronouns and normalize the fact that people identify differently. So in a lot of ways, the more people use the all gender bathroom, the better, even if it winds up being aligned, because then it's not just, oh, that's the bathroom for the queer people who we don't know if they're boys or girls. It's like, oh, that's the bathroom of choice because it's a single stall and I get some privacy and all those kind of things. So not making it the odd thing to do, but making it the regular thing to do is really, really helpful. Other things we'll do, so on our equipment list, rather than segregating it by gender or saying women, you might want to, bring tampons or bring the Diva cup, we just simply say people who might get their period. And it's a really easy distinction to make. And it makes people feel like, okay, I'm a dude and I'm still going to get my period, but at least they're not calling me a woman. Or we recommend for a lot of people a thing called the P style, which it's a stand to pee device. And so we'll say things like, for folks who can't pee standing up without a little help, we recommend the P style, check it out. And so we put it on everybody's forms, so it becomes clear that this is an option for everybody, and we're not calling anybody out. We're not pulling the gender nonconforming person aside and saying, hey, you know, you should have this device or something like that. So again, just trying to normalize more of the practices we do and make it across the board for everybody. We work with adults, so we're lucky in that we can let people select their own tent groups based on comfort level. But I would also do that if we were working with teenagers, and we would just talk to them about, you know, being responsible, because I recognize that people who want to make out are going to find a way to make out, whether they're boys and boys or girls and girls. And I think just being upfront about the conversation and talking about it with parents. When I was a teacher, this stuff goes on, kind of lets them off the hook a little bit and takes down their guard just a little bit. But I know that's a tricky issue for sure, but that's how we handle it. So hopefully you can see this. This is the way we talk about pronouns. And this will be in the resource list, so you can take a little bit closer look at it. But it's basically a little guide to, if I ask you your pronouns and then I mispronoun you, here's things not to do. So don't criticize somebody. Don't say that's not a real pronoun. They and theirs isn't grammatically correct. That's a hot button. Don't talk about grammar, because it's not really about grammar. Things that you can do when you mispronoun somebody, that's what's called when you call somebody the wrong pronoun. Apologize, move on. Don't make it about you. If I've had a lot of people say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I can't believe it, I feel terrible, and they go on, and then it becomes about them and not about them seeing my identity. So it's a learning process. You will figure it out faster than you think. I think it's like cognitive for maybe 4 or 6 weeks, and then it becomes normalized. But that's a huge thing. And I think if you were to do, you know, 1 or 2 things, I would put preferred name on your intake forms and do pronouns with everybody, and that will go really, really far to making people feel like you're practicing inclusivity and affirming them. So we want to talk about, Meg's going to talk a little bit about some more things that we can do broadly to make folks feel included.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about some specifics, and we can go into more of those in the Q&A and also in that resource list that we'll send you all. But more broadly, doing staff training on gender and sexuality, or any identity issues that, if you are not typically used to working with a particular population, or if your staff is all of one identity and your participants are not, doing staff training around that identity is really important, and it can allow people to feel a lot more comfortable and like it's normal for them to have questions. So I think normalizing, again, not that we want to say that there's only one way to do things, but normalizing this idea that we often don't get an opportunity to ask questions, or to say like, hey, I don't know what pronouns mean. I've never done intros with that. Why do we have to do that? Allowing your staff to ask that question and to feel okay about asking that question is really important. And so creating staff trainings or bringing someone in to do staff trainings is really important to allowing that space to happen. Connecting new practices. So let's say you do preferred name, or you say that, yes, we are an all boys summer camp, but we're going to allow trans boys to also come to our summer camp. Like connecting those things to your core values and saying like, because we're here to support boys and young men, and that's who these people are. And so we want to ensure that we're supporting them as well. Connecting new practices to your core values, I think, can really help your staff get behind it, as well as any board members or superiors or people just who are having a hard time seeing those parallels. Whatever the core values of your organization are, really focusing on like, how do those new practices support that? And then advocating and affirming participants and staff. So advocating for all of the better practices that we've talked about, and then practicing and doing those things yourself, that will make a huge difference. And not requiring the queer people in the room or the trans folks in the room to do that advocating, but advocating from a place of allyship can be really, really powerful, because that means you're taking on that responsibility as somebody who may not be directly affected by or obviously affected by the ideas, but who can really stand to benefit from more purposeful inclusion and advocacy. Anything you wanted to add there, Perry?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. All right, so we have reached the end of the chunk of our presentation, where we just talk about what we wanted to before we encountered all of you, but we really want to open it up at this point for question and answers. And we have a couple questions that we can speak to already, but if you have any questions about anything specific to your organization, anything specific to your setting or your environment, please throw them in the Q&A. Like I mentioned, we're going to be wrapping up in about the next 15 minutes, although me and Perry are happy to stick around and talk to folks. We can also promote you so that we can have a little more of a natural face-to-face conversation. But we also wanted to say that any questions that are asked in that Q&A, we can email to everybody the responses. So if you need to take off at this point, you won't miss anything, because anything that we answer, we'll be sure to get those questions and our answers or responses back to you. We won't include your name. I know that when you ask a question, it's attached to your sign-in, but we'll just put the question out there. So don't feel like it'll be attached to your name after this point. So yeah, please do ask any questions to throw them in that Q&A. Our contact information, we have at the bottom of the slide here. We have all of your emails from your signups. So we will be emailing you both the slideshow as well as the resource list that we've referenced a couple times later this afternoon, so you can kind of look out for that. But if you do want to get in contact with either of us at any point, feel free to jot down our emails and give us a shout. But at this point, we'll kind of jump into answering some of those questions.
Yeah. So one person asked for the resource list, which Meg said we will definitely send out to you after this. Somebody asked, there's a couple of terminology questions. Is either queer community or LGBTQ more appropriate to use? I think both are totally appropriate. You can mix them up, but definitely both. Does first person language apply for inclusivity here? Would someone prefer to be referred to as a person who is trans or a trans person? I don't think it matters. I think it might be a personal preference. I kind of refer to myself as a trans person, but I wouldn't be offended if somebody says Perry's trans, or that's a person who's trans.
Yeah, I've definitely heard it more as a trans person or the trans community or trans folks, rather than a person who is trans, mostly because I think that that's the way that we talk about disabilities, which I think is really important. Like a person who has ADD or a person who uses a wheelchair, and not that it's wrong, but I don't hear that language used as much when referring to the trans community, and I definitely wouldn't use it with sexuality stuff. So.
Yeah.
So somebody mentioned that a solution that they've seen in terms of being gender inclusive is, or attempting to be gender inclusive for bathrooms or for housing, is to provide singles for folks. This person didn't actually specify for which folks. It seems isolating. Are there any other solutions to doing that? And I think that so one solution that we did at my undergrad was we implemented a gender inclusive housing policy. And basically we said on the intake of first year students, we asked them, would you be interested in, do you require, or would you not be interested in living in all gender housing? And we explained that this means that your roommate will be chosen regardless of their gender, just based off of other things that we've distinguished would make you good roommates, like whether you stay up late or whether you have a lot of people over. And so we didn't ask someone are you trans, or are you genderqueer, or are you gender nonconforming? We just said, do you think you would like to live in an environment where gender isn't put as a central pivot point of who you're best going to be matched with? So one way to do that would be to offer to folks, like, do you require this? Is this the only way that you'll feel safe? And then allow other folks to opt into that and say, like, I don't require it, but I would be super happy to like room with anyone of any gender. So rather than providing singles, just allowing for people to opt in, knowing that the space is going to be not centered around folks' gender, and that people of all different types of gender identities might be their roommate, their tent mate, that sort of thing. I've also seen multi-stall all gender bathrooms. I don't believe that all gender bathrooms have to be single stall. It's just often the easiest solution when you're not like building a new facility, that sort of thing. I don't know if Perry has any different ideas on that one.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Meg has said. I think when it's isolating is if it's like, for example, in a lot of schools, the kids will be, well, you can use the bathroom in the nurse's office, and that's isolating and stigmatizing versus having one single stall bathroom that anybody can use at any time. I think that's just an available bathroom. And you're right. I mean, typically what they do is convert the ADA bathroom to be an all gender bathroom. But I'm not sure if what you're talking about is singles for roommate situations. And then I would go back to what Meg said, when you can have a great progressive university policy that allows people to choose when identity, gender identity isn't kind of the determining category, is really nice. And then I noticed somebody mentioned that for when they're camping to get around the university policy, they use tarps instead of tents. I think that's a great solution.
Bivy bag everywhere.
Yeah. But I mean, it makes sense, right? We can all get out of our tent and go change somewhere else if that's an issue. And probably if you don't want to change in front of, it may be less about changing in front of somebody of a different sex or gender than it is about changing in front of anybody, full stop. So that's the beauty of the woods. There's a lot of privacy to be found. But good point that sometimes you have to work around university policy, and that can be a lot harder than simply being out on a trip and saying, this is what we're going to do. And, you know, there are no overarching rules.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I accidentally deleted one that I think somebody asked, how can we start, or how can we begin to not marginalize groups of people?
Yep.
I think you're doing what you're doing, coming here, educating yourself, learning about what does it mean to marginalize people, what does it mean to privilege different groups, and how can we start using language and practices that are affirming and inclusive. I think that is a phenomenal beginning and a great place to start. So I think you're doing it.
I think the other big thing that, again, that is what you're doing is by listening. So a lot of times people talk about like, oh, that community doesn't have a voice, or that community, is silenced. But there's a lot of times where we're also just not being heard. So listen to what people are telling you, and as much as possible, and not to say that you're doing this, but take it seriously, because sometimes it'll be like, well, that's a really specific request from one person, but that person may be the only person willing to come forward with that request, and it may be actually a larger amount of the population that like feels the need for that resource or that support, but doesn't know how to ask for it. So I think that kind of checking that gut reaction of like, ooh, like, is that actually important, or is that something that's like really only necessary for one or two people that may be on our trips or within our participant groups? I think considering, well, what is the harm in doing that? I think that's a really good thing, is to really go back to that ability of listening, and then to just know that also we're all learning and unlearning as we go. We all grew up in a society, kind of regardless of where we were, where certain things were normalized and privileged. And so this is going to be an ongoing process of learning and unlearning. And the sooner that you accept that, like, that means that you're always going to like have a new thing to learn or unlearn, and are okay with that, the more that process will feel less like, oh, I can't believe I still have more to go on this subject. Because I think, as somebody who's part of both marginalized and privileged identity groups and identities, I can often get down on myself when I feel like, man, I'm so blind to so many privileges that I have. But the more and more I know that that's going to continue to happen, and accept that fact, the better I am at preparing myself for those kind of future stumbles. Yeah. All right. So go ahead, Perry.
No, I was just going to say thank you, everybody. Like Meg mentioned, we'll stick around for a few more minutes if anybody wants to talk after. We will be at AEE in Portland in October. We would love to see you there. Give us a shout, come see us. It'll be a much more interactive conversation where we'll continue this. Also, we're going to send out feedback forms this afternoon. We are really excited to share this information with you. We're excited to give you this gift, and the gift we'd love to get in exchange is a very little bit of feedback. This was our first webinar, and we'd just love to hear some thoughts on it. It should take you at most 5 minutes. And we will also give you another gift of a resource list that will come along this afternoon. And like Meg said, please feel free to contact us. As you can tell, we're passionate about this. We're really excited to share our experiences and hear yours and connect with folks. So if we can be helpful, or if you just want to talk, please do get in touch with us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciated the interaction and you taking the time to join us today. So yeah, we hope to see some of you in Portland, and if not, to contact some of you with our emails and be in touch in other ways. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.